Before this video begins, I need you to do one thing. Close whatever other tab you have open. Put the phone face up where you can see the screen. Understand before the first story starts that every single person you are about to hear from was a professional, trained, competent, experienced adult doing a job they knew inside and out. Not someone who was tired, not someone who was imagining things, not someone who had a reason to lie. These are people who spent their careers being exactly right about exactly the things their job required them to be right about. And then one day, in the middle of ordinary work, in the middle of a building they knew, a file they had opened 100 times, a phone call they had answered 1,000 times, something was there that should not have been there. 10 stories, 10 professionals. 10 moments where the ordinary world stopped behaving the way it had always behaved. One of these settings is one you are in right now. From True Terror Files Official, we start in 10 seconds. Use them. Welcome back to True Terror Files Official, the channel that believes you are owed the truth. All of it, without softening and without apology. Because the people in these stories are telling you something real, and they deserve to be heard. Tonight we have 10 stories, and tonight's theme is precision, because what makes every single one of these accounts different from what you might expect from a horror channel is that they are not about monsters or darkness or things lurking in abandoned places. They are about accuracy. They are about people who are trained to notice when something is wrong. Forensic accountants, pharmacists, engineers, analysts, counselors, people whose entire professional value is the reliable detection of discrepancy. And what happens when those people find a discrepancy that their training gives them no framework to address? A forensic accountant who discovers that 4 dead employees are doing the best work of their careers. A hospice chaplain receiving prayer requests from patients who haven't arrived yet. A dental hygienist who finds the same impossible cavity in every patient she treats for 7 straight days. A building inspector who has been approving structures that officially do not exist. Crisis counselor whose caller knows everything about him. These are not stories about ghosts. They're stories about the precision with which something we do not have a name for has been paying attention to us. To our files, our systems, our routines, our professional records, and operating inside them, correctly and without error, for longer than anyone knew to look. Stay close. Do not move. This is True Terror Files Official, and tonight we tell you everything. Cassius Wren was 46 years old and had spent 21 years working as a forensic accountant. The last 7 as an independent consultant retained by corporate boards, navigating internal compliance reviews and financial irregularity investigations. And he was good at this work in the precise and unglamorous way of someone who had chosen it, not because it was impressive, but because it suited the part of him that found genuine satisfaction in the reconciliation of numbers. In the way a correctly constructed financial record told a complete and truthful story about an organization's behavior over time. And when the board of Claverton Manufacturing, a regional industrial supply company with 412 employees, 3 production facilities, and annual revenues of approximately $63 million, retained him in the autumn to conduct a comprehensive internal audit. Following the accelerated retirement of its long-tenured CFO under circumstances the board characterized with the specific, diplomatic vagueness of a governance body that had already decided on a narrative but had not yet determined how much of it to share. Cassius accepted the engagement without asking questions he knew the work would eventually answer, because the work always answered them. The first 3 weeks were unremarkable in the way forensic engagements often began unremarkably. The surface records were orderly, and broadly consistent. The major accounts were documented, the tax filings were competent, the capital expenditure records coherent with the company's stated operational profile, and it was in the fourth week. Running a granular payroll audit and cross-referencing the active payroll file against the HR system and the company's group benefits, administration records as part of a standard benefits compliance review, that he found the name Doris Atwell. Doris Atwell appeared in the active payroll as a mid-level procurement coordinator at the Birmingham facility, drawing a salary of $62,000 annually, her record presenting as complete and unremarkable 7 years of employment history. Annual performance reviews with supervisors' sign-offs, salary adjustments properly documented and approved, a direct deposit to a regional bank account processed on the company's standard bi-weekly schedule, and procurement activity in the purchasing system current and uninterrupted, purchase orders logged under her credential and approved through the standard workflow on dates extending to the previous Tuesday, and it was. Only when Cassius cross-referenced her HR record against the group life insurance file that the discrepancy appeared. The insurance records showed a death benefit payout processed for years prior, made to a named beneficiary in the standard amount for her salary band. And when he requested the full compliance archive he found, buried 4 levels below the active file, in a subdirectory the HR system's standard reporting interface did not surface. A death notification form dated the same week as the insurance payout, signed by her direct supervisor, citing cardiac arrest at age 54. The standard form that was supposed to trigger an immediate termination sequence, removing her from the active payroll, deactivating her credentials, closing her benefits enrollment, and archiving her employment file, in which had, through some procedural integration failure that Cassius spent the better part of 3 days attempting to reconstruct without success, apparently triggered none of those things. Because Doris Atwell had been dead for 4 years and her credentials had never been deactivated, and her procurement work had continued without interruption or observable change in quality across every one of those 4 years. Her purchase orders processed, her supplier communications generated, her budget authorizations approved. All of it passing through the review and authorization layers that required active colleagues to interact with her. Submissions on a weekly basis without anyone raising a question or filing a concern. He ran a comprehensive check of the complete active payroll against the HR archive and the benefits records. And he found 3 more. Gerald Platt, facilities manager who had died of a stroke 2 years prior, whose maintenance logs for those 2 years were detailed, dated, and consistent in style with his pre-death entries. A salary of $84,000 depositing bi-weekly into an account in his name. Anne-Marie Cosgrove, a logistics coordinator dead for 6 years in an automobile accident, whose shipping coordination records for those 6 years were complete and uninterrupted, not redistributed to colleagues but attributed to her alone. Consistent in methodology, absent any gap that would indicate the work had changed hands. And Stuart Waite, an R&D laboratory technician dead for 5 years of a long illness, whose bench notes filled the laboratory's physical notebook sequence for those 5 years in handwriting, consistent with pre-death samples. His requisitions filed under his credential and approved without question by the procurement function, a function that Cassius now understood included one of his 3 fellow deceased colleagues. The combined payroll expenditure for the 4 deceased employees over their post-death employment periods was $1.4 million, paid to bank accounts that were operational, compliant, generating no regulatory flags, conducting no transactions beyond passive accumulation, no withdrawals, no transfers, no ATM or point-of-sale activity. simply money building in 4 accounts that appeared from every institutional perspective to belong to 4 living people. And when the banking compliance attorney retained by the board investigated the accounts, the financial institutions confirmed that they were technically legitimate, had been opened with valid documentation, and had recorded 0 human interactions of any kind since their respective opening dates, and that every administrative attempt to close the accounts had been declined by the institution's systems on the grounds that closure had not been authorized by the account holders. And when the attorney asked how the institution's systems were determining that deceased account holders had declined to authorize closure, the institutions provided responses that satisfied the technical question and entirely failed to address the actual one. The work produced under the 4 deceased employees' credentials was reviewed by active Claverton staff with the relevant expertise, and the reviewers reported with a consensus that Cassius found more troubling than any of the financial findings that the work produced. After each employee's death was materially better than the work produced before it, Doris. Atwell's post-death procurement decisions showed measurably superior supplier selection and significantly more accurate budget forecasting. Gerald Platt's post-death maintenance logs reflected a more systematic and anticipatory approach to preventive maintenance than his living work had demonstrated. And Amari. Cosgrove's post-death logistics coordination had reduced shipping errors by a percentage that her former supervisor characterized as representing a genuine operational improvement. And Stuart Waite's post-death laboratory notes showed a depth of analytical insight that his former research director described as, quote, not consistent with the Stuart I worked with for 8 years, who was a competent technician, but was not this. And Cassius sat alone in the Claverton conference room on the final night of his engagement with the 4 personnel files open in front of him. The bank records and the compliance attorney's report and the work quality assessments arranged in a row he had organized with the same precision. He applied to every financial document, and he understood the specific and entirely unwelcome clarity of a person trained to follow evidence to its conclusion, regardless of the conclusion's shape. That what the records described was not an administrative error, and not a payroll integration failure, and not any category of financial irregularity he had a framework to investigate, but something using for dead people's professional identities to perform their jobs in a company of 400 people. Through systems reviewed daily by active employees, in physical notebooks handled by living hands and performing them better year by year than the 4 people themselves had managed while they were alive. And he closed the files and wrote his report and recommended a comprehensive HR system audit and payroll integration review. And he named none of this in any section of the document, and he has not taken a payroll audit engagement since. And the 4 accounts, as of the last communication he received from the banking compliance attorney, remain open. Amma Delacroix had served as a non-denominational hospice chaplain for 14 years. The last 9 at the Fairvale Palliative Care Center, a 32-bed residential facility in the hill country of Central Tennessee, and she understood the spiritual dimensions of that work with the calm and unsentimentalized depth of someone who had sat with human beings at the absolute threshold of their lives often, enough to have developed a specific and earned relationship with what those thresholds contained. Because hospice chaplaincy was not theology in any abstract sense, but theology at its most immediate, most physical, most irreducible. It was sitting with a person in the last days of their life and being, genuinely and completely present with them in whatever that meant to them specifically, not imposing a framework, but offering a presence. And Amma was gifted at this in the way that people are gifted at things that require not a particular skill, but a particular quality of character. And she had in 9 years earned the specific and hard-won trust of a facility that dealt daily with experiences that most institutions found destabilizing. She maintained a prayer request board in the chaplaincy office, a simple corkboard on which patients, family members, and staff could pin written prayer requests. The tradition having developed organically in her second year, when a patient had handed her a folded note and asked her to keep it somewhere visible. And others had noticed, and the practice had expanded, and the board was a genuine working document. Changed weekly, the requests ranging from the specific to the expansive, the deeply personal to the simply stated, and Amma took it seriously as a pastoral record and kept it current, removing fulfilled or expired requests with a small ceremony of acknowledgement, adding new ones with attention to the handwriting and the need beneath it. The first anomalous request appeared on a Monday morning in February, pinned to the board when she arrived at 8 a.m. after a weekend she had not worked. A folded note written in a careful and somewhat shaky hand on the facility's standard request paper, requesting prayers for a woman named Cecile Armand, 78 years old, for strength and peace in her final transition. The language of the request consistent with the kind written by a patient's family member or close friend rather than by a staff member or by the patient themselves. Amma checked the patient's census. Fairvale ran between 28 and 32 occupants, and she knew every current patient by name. And there was no patient named Cecile Armand on the census, and there was no admission pending under that name in the admissions record. And she asked the weekend nursing staff about the request, and no one had seen who had placed it on the board. And the board was not in a publicly accessible location, but within the chaplaincy corridor, which required a staff keycard to access. An AMA documented the note and placed it in the chaplaincy miscellaneous file and turned to the week's work. Cecile Armand was admitted to Fairvale 4 days later. On Thursday morning, 78 years old, in the final stage of a progressive neurological illness, and Amma stood at the admission window and watched the intake team receive her and understood what she was looking at with a quietness that surprised her. The quietness of a person whose framework for what was possible was being adjusted by something they had not yet named, and she met Cecile that afternoon. And Cecile was the specific kind of patient AMA recognized immediately, a person who had already completed whatever internal work their dying required and who needed presence more than guidance, and Cecile died peacefully 11 days later, and Amma had removed her request from the board the morning after the death with the ceremony she always used. The second request appeared 3 weeks later, a note for a man named Odell Francis, 64, requesting prayers for comfort and for his family's strength in accepting a situation they were not ready for. And there was no Odell Francis on the census, and there was no admission pending. And Odell Francis was admitted 7 days later, 64 years old, cardiac end stage, and he died 18 days after that. The third request appeared for a woman named Pearl Ogundimu, and the fourth for a retired teacher named Clarence Bauer, and the fifth for a woman named Rosita Herrera, each request appearing on the chaplaincy board between 4 and 9 days before the named individual's admission to Fairvale. Each note written in a handwriting that was different each time, not the same author. And each request specific enough to describe not only the patient's name and age, but the nature of what they needed one asked for. Prayers for reconciliation with an estranged child. one for prayers for the courage to release a long-held grief. One asked simply that someone please read Psalm 23 in the room at the end, details that could not have been known from a referral record, and that AMA, when she met each patient, confirmed were accurate. The estranged child reel, the grief reel, the psalm, the right one. She brought the notes to the facility director after the 5th instance, and the director reviewed the documentation and the admission records with a measured seriousness, and then asked, with the careful tone of a supervisor navigating a pastoral disclosure they did not have a policy for, whether AMA had any explanation she was comfortable offering, and AMA said she did not have an explanation she was comfortable offering, but she had an explanation she was prepared to sit with, which was that something was asking her to be ready, specifically and by name, for each of the people who were coming, and that she intended to honor that, and the director, who had worked in palliative care for 30 years and had developed the specific epistemological humility of a person who has witnessed the full range of what human beings experience at the boundary of their lives, sat with this for a long moment, and then said, "Then be ready." There have been 21 requests since AMA began tracking them, and every single person named in those requests has been admitted to Fairvale within 9 days of the request appearing. And Amma has been in every one of their rooms when it mattered, present and prepared in exactly the way the request specified. And she is not determined who is writing the notes, and she has stopped trying to determine it because the question of who is writing them is, she has concluded, considerably less important than the question of why they are being written. And the answer to that question is visible in every room she enters with the notes. Instructions already in her heart. Someone is making sure the right person is ready for the people who are coming. And the right person, in all 21 cases, has been her. Fiona Quill had been a registered dental hygienist for 16 years, the last 11 of which she had worked at a general dental practice in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, a four-dentist group practice with a patient roster of approximately 3,000 and a pace of work that required, from its hygienists, the specific and highly calibrated professionalism of people who perform the same precise set of tasks many hundreds of times each year with no reduction in attention or accuracy, because inattention in dental hygiene was not a theoretical problem, but a clinical one, and Fiona had the attention. Had chosen the profession specifically because the combination of physical precision and patient relationships suited her particular temperament in a way that most other health professions she had considered did not, and she was. In the specific and unflashy way of a clinician who had been very good at her job for a long time, genuinely proud of her accuracy. The anomaly began on a Monday in October. The first patient of the morning, a 40-year-old accountant named Trevor Marsh, who had been a patient of the practice for 7 years, and whom Fiona knew from his chart as someone with strong oral hygiene, low Kara's risk, and a consistent record of clean or near clean checkups. And when she performed his examination, recording observations in the usual sequence, she found a small carious lesion on the mesial surface of tooth number 14, the upper left first molar. At the cemento-enamel junction, a specific and precisely located early cavity at the point where the tooth's root surface met the crown, a location that she noted, documented, and flagged for the attending dentist's review, and then moved through the rest of Trevor's appointment without incident. The second patient of the morning was a 26-year-old graduate student named Sarah Kowalski, new to the practice. Presenting for her first appointment, with a complete and current set of dental records from her previous provider showing no caries in the previous 2 years. And when Fiona performed the examination, she found a small carious lesion on the mesial surface of tooth 14, upper left first molar, at the cemento-enamel junction, in precisely the same location as the lesion she had found on Trevor Marsh 40 minutes earlier. And she paused for a long enough moment that Sarah asked if something was wrong, and Fiona said no, made a note, and completed the appointment. The third patient was a 53-year-old retired postal worker named Doug Hendricks, a patient of 11 years with a history of moderate caries activity in his younger years and a much cleaner record in the decade since he had improved his home care routine. And Fiona found on his examination a small carious lesion on the mesial surface of tooth 14, upper left first molar, at the cemento-enamel junction. And she sat back from the chair and looked at her notes and looked at the ceiling for a moment before calling Dr. Anand from the adjacent operatory to perform a secondary examination, and Dr. Anand confirmed the lesion's presence, location, and staging, and looked at Fiona with an expression that was professionally neutral but contained. At its edges, the particular quality of a person who has noticed something they are not yet going to name. And Fiona completed 4 more patients that day, a retired nurse, a high school student, a 30-year-old software engineer, and an elderly woman whose chart showed she had received tooth number 14 dental work 18 months prior that should have eliminated any surface susceptibility at the cemento-enamel junction, and every single one of them. All 7 patients on that Monday presented with an identical early carious lesion at precisely the same location on precisely the same tooth. She examined her instruments, her technique, her probe calibration, operatory's lighting and chair positioning, and found no mechanical or procedural explanation for a finding that was, by every standard of clinical probability, not possible. 7 patients drawn from a general population, ranging in age from 17 to 79, with varying hygiene histories, dietary habits, fluoride exposure levels, and medical backgrounds. Should not all present on the same day with an identical lesion at an identical point, and yet they had. And the dentist who examined each of the 7 confirmed the lesion's presence. And the practice's radiographs for the 7 patients taken that same day showed lesion in each case at the same stage of progression. Consistent in depth and surface area across patients whose dental histories were entirely different. She came in on Tuesday and examined 8 patients and found the lesion in every one tooth 14. Mesial surface, cemento-enamel junction, early stage. Consistent dimensions, and on Wednesday she examined 9 patients and found it in all 9. And by Thursday, she had begun writing everything down in a private notebook she kept, separate from the clinical record. Because the clinical record was what it was: documented findings, confirmed by dentists, treated where appropriate. But the private notebook was the record of what those findings meant as a pattern. And by the end of Thursday, she had seen 31 consecutive patients with the same cavity at the same location. And she had not yet missed one, and no colleague in the practice had found it in any patient Fiona had not already examined. Meaning that the pattern was not in the patient population, but was specific to her, to her hands. To something in the sequence of what happened when Fiona Quill examined a patient's tooth 14 that produced a finding that should not have been reproducible 31 times without variation. On Friday, she came to work, and the first patient of the morning was a 7-year-old boy with a complete primary dentition and no secondary molars erupted, meaning tooth 14 did not yet exist in his mouth. And Fiona examined the site where tooth 14 would eventually erupt, and there was nothing there. And she completed the appointment and moved to the second patient, a 32-year-old woman, and found tooth 14 present in the mesial cemento and a minimal junction clean. No lesion. Nothing. And for the first time in 5 days, the cavity was not there. And she sat with this for the rest of the day, examining 7 more patients whose tooth 14s were all clean. And at the end of Friday, she sat in the empty operatory for a long time trying to identify what was different about this week compared to any other, and finding nothing. And then she opened the private notebook and looked at the list of 31 names and the identical finding recorded next to each one. And she thought about what it would mean if the explanation was not instrumental or procedural or coincidental. If the explanation was that for 5 consecutive working days something had been in the room with her, present in the space where her hands met each patient's tooth, producing the same finding over and over, not because the finding was there, but because it needed to be found. And she closed the notebook and has kept it in a locked drawer at home for the 3 years since. And she still examines tooth 14 first on every patient she sees. And it has never happened again, and she does not know whether she is relieved or whether the absence of the finding is itself a kind of message whose meaning she has not yet understood. Beatrice Holst had been a licensed building inspector for 23 years, working for the city's Department of Planning and Development Oversight. And she understood structural inspection with the practiced authority of a professional whose entire function was the protection of public safety, the verification that buildings constructed or modified within city jurisdiction met the applicable codes for structural integrity, fire safety, accessibility, and environmental compliance, the authority to approve or fail any structure at any stage of construction, and the accountability that came with an approval stamp that meant a building was safe for human occupation, and she had in 23 years developed. The specific and hard-earned confidence of someone who knew what they were looking at when they walked a site, who could read a structure's compliance status in the time it took to walk its perimeter, and who had never, in 2 decades of inspections, approved a structure she had reason to doubt. The anomaly surfaced not in a moment of investigation, but in a moment of administrative routine. She was reviewing her completed inspection records for the previous quarter as part of the department's annual performance audit, a standard process in which each inspector verified that their filed approvals matched the apartment's permit records, and she found an entry in her own records for a structure she did not recognize. The entry was fully complete: her badge number, her signature, the property address, the inspection type, the approval date, all consistent with the format she had used for 23 years, and it showed a commercial occupancy inspection approval she had filed 11 months prior for a property at an address in the Millhaven district, a 3-story mixed-use structure she had apparently visited and approved as compliant for occupancy, and when she cross-referenced the address against the department's permit database, the address returned no active permit, no permit history, no zoning record, no parcel record of any kind. The address existed as a geographic coordinate within city boundaries, but had no official existence in any municipal record system, no tax parcel, no utility connection record, no planning history, not a single official document to support the existence of a structure at that location, and yet her own inspection record, filed under her own credential, showed that she had visited it, walked it, and approved it as compliant nearly a year ago. She drove to the address on her lunch break, and the building was there, a 3-storied brick structure on the corner of a commercial block, fully constructed, occupied with a bakery on the ground floor that appeared to be in active operation, and residential units visible through the second and third floor windows, a building that looked as though it had been standing for 20 or 30 years. And she stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked at it for a long time before going home and pulling her full inspection. Archived for the past 3 years, and she found 7 more entries for structures she did not recognize at addresses that returned no records in the department's database. A 4-story residential building, a single-story warehouse, a community facility, a mixed-use corner property, a light industrial structure. 2 others, all approved under her credential, all dated across the previous 3 years, all returning no official existence in any city record system. And when she visited each address, she found each structure physically present, occupied, functioning, apparently established. None of them new construction, all of them presenting as buildings that had been standing for years. In locations the city's official records insisted were empty parcels or did not exist as addressable locations at all. She filed an internal disclosure with the department's compliance officer, a careful and entirely factual account that named no theory and made no characterization beyond the factual discrepancy between her records. In the permit database and the compliance review that followed over 6 weeks, confirmed that the 8 entries were genuine. Records filed under her genuine credential and her genuine signature. And that none of the 8 addresses had any permit history in the city system, and that the structures were physically present and occupied. In the compliance officer's summary, in the specific and careful language of an official document navigating a finding it cannot categorize, stated that the origin of the 8 inspection records was administratively unresolved and recommended a review of the department's credential security protocols. And Beatrice sat with the summary and understood that what it meant was that no one in the department was going to follow this further, because following it further required asking a question the department's framework could not answer. Who had been using Beatrice Holst's credential for 3 years to approve buildings that the city of record had no knowledge of, and where those buildings had come from, and who lived in them, and what exactly. They had paid for the approval of a building inspector who had no memory of ever being there. Jerome Adebayo had worked as a crisis intervention counselor for 11 years. The last 6 at the Westbrook Regional Crisis Center, a 24-hour telephone-based mental health support service, covering a 6-county area in the Midwest, and he was skilled at the work in the deep and hard-won way of someone who had chosen it with full knowledge of its cost. Understanding from the beginning that crisis counseling required a specific kind of sustained emotional availability that not everyone could maintain over years, and that the people who could maintain it were the people who had found a way to be genuinely present with another person's pain without being consumed by it, and Jerome had found that way. It built over 11 years, a professional practice grounded in careful training, regular supervision, and the specific and genuine empathy that cannot be taught but can be developed. And he was considered by his colleagues and supervisors to be one of the center's most reliable and effective counselors. The person who took the most complex calls and handled them with the consistency and care that the work required. The call came in at 2:27 a.m. on a Thursday in March, the overnight shift, which Jerome worked 3 nights a week, and it was flagged by the routing system as a general distress call. No specific crisis classification, and he answered in the standard way and identified himself as Jerome and asked how he could help. And the person on the line, a man, mid-range adult voice, calm in the specific way of someone who has been preparing what they are going to say, said, "I'm not calling for myself, calling about you." Jerome held the line in the professional way he had been, trained to hold unusual openings without response with complete attention. With no withdrawal of presence, and the man continued, "I'm standing outside the Westbrook Crisis Center right now. I can see your window. The blinds are tilted at about 30 degrees and there's a blue pen on your desk to the right of your keyboard." Jerome looked at the blue pen on his desk and the blinds at approximately 30 degrees and said, in the level voice of a person managing their own response, "Can you tell me what's happening for you tonight?" The man said, "I know you live on Calder Street, 3rd floor, the building with the green door on the street level. I know your car is the silver Honda in the parking structure on 5th, spot B12. I know you have a sister named Rosalind and that you call her on Sunday afternoons. That the last time you called her, you talked for 42 minutes. Jerome did not respond immediately. The center's standard protocol in calls involving potential caller knowledge of counselor information was to remain on the line and activate the location and trace procedure, and he stayed on the line and pressed the silent alert that triggered the trace and activated his supervisor's notification. And the man said, "I'm not a threat, Jerome. I want you to understand that. I'm trying to tell you something important, and this was the only way I knew you would listen long enough to hear it. I have been watching you for 4 months, not maliciously. Please understand. I needed to know what kind of person you were before I told you what I'm going to tell you." Jerome's supervisor appeared at the control room window, behind the glass partition, and Jerome kept his voice level and asked the man to tell him what he wanted him to know. And the man said, "There is going to be a call. Not tonight. In the next 3 weeks. Young woman named Petra. She will call between 11 p.m. and midnight. She will tell you she is fine. She is not fine. Everyone she speaks to is going to believe her. Your protocols, your risk assessment tools, your standard screening, all of it will indicate low risk. She is extremely good at this. I have heard her on the phone, and she sounds fine in a way that is indistinguishable from actually being fine, and the standard tools will not catch it. And without intervention, she will not survive the night she calls. I am telling you now so that when she calls, you remember that I told you, and you listen past the tools? The trace returned the caller's location as the sidewalk outside the Westbrook Crisis Center, and the security guard on overnight was dispatched and found the sidewalk empty and the call dropped simultaneously. And the police review conducted over the following days established no surveillance equipment in or near the building. No breach of Jerome's personal information through any traceable channel, and no identification of the caller. Jerome documented the call fully and submitted it to his supervisor and the center's security consultant, and he filed a report with the local police. He went home and checked his car in spot B12 and stood outside his building with the green door at street level and called his sister Rosalind on a Thursday, not a Sunday, because he needed to hear her voice and could not explain why. And Rosalind talked for 42 minutes the way she always did. And Jerome listened and said very little and felt the specific and unwelcome sensation of a person whose private life has been accurately described by a stranger, which is not fear exactly, but is the precise recognition that a boundary you did not know existed has already been crossed by someone who knew where it was. 17 days later, at 11:41 p.m. on a Wednesday, A call came in from a young woman who identified herself as Petra, and she said she had been having a hard week and wanted to talk to someone. And her voice was calm, and her responses to Jerome's questions were measured, and her risk assessment indicators were all in the low. Range, she spoke about the future with appropriate specificity. She had plans for the following weekend. She described a support network. She answered every screen question in the language of someone who did not need immediate intervention. And Jerome heard all of this, and heard underneath it the thing the man had told him to listen for, the practiced quality of the calmness, the way it had been built rather than felt, the specific fluency of someone who had taken this particular test many times and knew all the right answers. And he stayed on the line past the point where standard protocol would have moved toward closure. He said, "Petra, I'm going to stay on with you tonight as long as you need. It's not because the screening says you need it, because I'm here and there's nowhere else I need to be." There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. And then Petra began to speak in a different voice, the voice underneath the prepared one, and Jerome stayed on the line with her for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and at 2:44 a.m., an ambulance and a crisis response team were dispatched to her address. And Petra was alive when they arrived, and is alive now. And Jerome has never identified the man who called him on that Thursday in March. Has never found any explanation for how he was known so precisely, or how Petra was known so far in advance. And he has one guiding principle now that he has added to his own clinical practice, shares with every new counselor he trains. The tools are necessary, and the tools are not enough. And there will be calls in your career where everything in the data says the person is fine, and everything in you says they are not. And on those calls you stay, you listen past the tools. You trust the thing that cannot be measured. Because sometimes, and Jerome has come to believe in the 11 years since, that this is not coincidence, but something closer to a design he does not have the language to name. The right information reaches the right person through whatever channel is available, and the only question is whether that person is paying enough attention to receive it. Simone Beauchamp had been a certified public accountant for 19 years, the last 12 as the sole proprietor of a small firm in a mid-sized city in the Louisiana Delta region, managing the books and tax compliance for a client roster of approximately 85 small businesses, professional practices, and individual high-net-worth accounts. And she was thorough and meticulous, and had built her practice's entire reputation on the specific and unglamorous virtue of accuracy her clients retained. Her not because she was innovative or aggressive, but because she was correct. Because her filings were clean, her reconciliations were complete. Her estimates were reliable, and in 12 years of independent practice, she had never filed an amended return that was not the result of a client providing her with information they had previously withheld rather than an error on her part. And the ledger that began the worst professional year of her life arrived. As most of her client materials arrived through the secure document portal she used for sensitive financial documents, uploaded without a cover note, attributed to a client account she did not recognize. The client ID in the portal was a 9-digit number formatted identically to the IDs she generated for her own clients. But the number did not appear in her client database and generated no match in the portal's client directory. And the uploaded file was a general ledger, a complete double-entry bookkeeping. Record covering 22 months of financial activity for an entity whose name appeared at the top of each page as Meridian Threshold LLC, A 47-page document that was clean, professionally formatted, and internally consistent in a way that Simone recognized immediately as the work of someone who actually understood double-entry accounting. Not a casual or improvised record, but a maintained and accurate one. She reviewed it with the professional reflex of a person who reads financial documents the way other people read text, in the specific and automatic way of someone who has processed thousands of them and for whom the structure of a balance sheet is as immediate and readable as a paragraph, and the ledger described a real business. Regular income entries from multiple recurring sources. Operating expenses consistent with a service-based entity. Payroll distributions too, for consistent personnel. Tax reserve allocations made on schedule. Vendor payments to real and verifiable businesses. The full picture of a functioning small company with annual revenues of approximately $2.3 million. She could find no record of Meridian Threshold LLC in the state's business entity registry, in the federal tax identification system, in any corporate filing database she could access. And the street address listed in the ledger's header corresponded to a building in the warehouse district she had driven past many times. A nondescript, single-story commercial structure that she had never had occasion to enter or inquire about. What she found when she reviewed the ledger more carefully, past the initial professional read, past the assessment of format and accuracy, into the specific content of the entries themselves, was the thing that moved the document from the category of unexplained administrative anomaly into something she has not been able to categorize satisfactorily in the 3 years since. The vendor payments included, on a recurring monthly basis, payments to her own firm, to Beauchamp CPLC, in amounts consistent with her standard monthly retainer fee, processed on the specific billing date she used with all her clients, and attributed in the ledger's notation field with the specific account service description she used on her own invoices, the exact language. Her exact phrasing and the payment history in the ledger extended 19 months back, meaning that Meridian Threshold LLC had been paying Beauchamp CPA LLC for accounting services for 19 months, and Simone had no record of these payments, had never invoiced this client, had never opened an engagement, had never received a wire or a check or an electronic payment from any source she could connect to this entity. And yet the ledger was correct in every other particular it was possible for her to verify, the payments processed on her billing dates, in her standard amounts, with her standard service notations, as though someone had been maintaining a detailed and accurate record of a professional relationship that Simone herself had no knowledge of being in. She drove to the warehouse district address and stood outside the building for a long time before she went in. And the building's interior was a single open commercial space that was fully occupied. Desks, equipment. For people working at those desks who looked up when she entered, and a woman at the nearest desk asked if she could help her, and Simone said she was looking for Meridian Threshold, and the woman said that was them. And Simone asked to speak to whoever managed the company's accounting. A man came out of a glass-walled office at the rear, early 50s. Professional manner, entirely untroubled by her presence, and Simone said she had received their ledger and didn't understand how it had reached her portal, and the man said, "We've been your client for almost 2 years, Simone. We upload the ledger on the 1st of every month." She said she had no record of that. And he looked at her with an expression she has spent 3 years trying to classify, not surprise, not confusion. Something that looked more like the contained patience of a person who has been expecting a conversation and had prepared for it. And he said, "We know. We've been wondering when you'd notice." She asked him to explain what that meant, and he said he would be happy to explain. And he gestured toward the office, and Simone Beauchamp made the decision in that moment that she has replayed every day since. She thanked him and walked back out of the building, got in her car, and drove directly to her office. And she has not returned to that address, and the portal access for the Meridian Threshold Client ID has been removed. And the ledger has been printed and locked in the physical file cabinet she keeps for documents she does not know how to classify. And she does not know what the man in the glass office would have told her, and she has decided carefully, deliberately, after 3 years of living with the decision, that she does not want to find out. Hadley Voss had been a registered nurse for 18 years, the last 9 specializing in overnight inpatient care on the neurology ward of a regional hospital in the Pacific Northwest, and she understood the specific and particular rhythm of overnight hospital work with the deep familiarity of someone for whom 3 a.m. in a quiet ward was not unsettling, but simply the environment in which she did the best version of her job, the reduced ambient noise, the concentrated attention, the particular quality of trust that developed between overnight staff and the patients who lay awake in the small hours and needed. More than anything, the reliable and uncomplicated presence of someone who knew what they were doing and was not going to leave. She was good at that presence. Been told by patients and by the families of patients that there was something specific and valuable in the way Hadley moved through a ward at night. It's unhurried and attentive, and she took this as the professional compliment it was intended to be, and did not analyze it further, because there was nothing to analyze. She simply cared about the work and the people the work was for, which was the whole of it. The patient in bed 7 was admitted on a Tuesday evening, a 67-year-old retired civil engineer named Gordon Vance, post-operative neurological monitoring following a procedure for a benign meningioma. Routine by the standards of the unit. A man who was awake when Hadley arrived on shift at 11 p.m. and who introduced himself with the specific courtesy of a person who had been raised in a time when courtesy was not optional, and who asked her name and repeated it back correctly and said he was glad to meet her. She performed his neuro checks on schedule, hourly through the first 4 hours, as post-op protocol required, and Gordon was alert-oriented, yet conversational in the specific way of a patient who processed anxiety through talk. And he told her about his career and his wife. Francis, who had gone home for the night, and his 3 adult children, and the dog they had acquired 6 months ago, against his better judgment, and now loved completely. And Hadley listened and performed her checks, and completed her documentation, and moved through the rest of the ward on her circuit. And at her 2 a.m. check, Gordon was asleep, and his vitals were normal, and she noted this and moved on. At 3:15, she was at the nurse's station completing chart work when she heard Gordon's call light activate. And she went to bed 7, and Gordon was sitting up in bed and wide awake, and he said, "There was someone in here." Hadley looked at the room, which contained Gordon and the monitoring equipment and the overnight standard furnishings and nothing else, and said there wasn't anyone else on this side of the ward at this hour. And Gordon said he was standing at the foot of the bed, an older man. He was wearing street clothes, not a hospital gown. It's not scrubs. He was standing there and looking at me and not saying anything. Hadley completed a quiet check of the ward, the other occupied rooms, the corridor, the supply room, the shared bathroom, and found nothing. And the ward's entry required a key card after 10 p.m. And the keycard log showed no entry or exit in the previous 90 minutes except her own circuit. She told Gordon that no one had been in the room and that post-operative neurological patients sometimes experienced perceptual vents that were transient and medication related and did not indicate a clinical concern. Rowan Beckett was 38 years old and worked as a radio frequency engineer for a national telecommunications infrastructure company, managing the signal integrity and interference analysis for a cluster of transmission towers across a mountainous region of the American Southwest. The work was technical and solitary, and suited him in the way that technical and solitary work suits people who think precisely and prefer the company of quantifiable problems to the company of most other humans. And he had been doing it for 12 years with the specific and unfashionable satisfaction of someone who genuinely enjoyed their work and did not feel the need to apologize for the fact that their work involved driving long distances to remote equipment installations and spending hours alone in the company of instrumentation. The anomaly appeared during a routine spectral scan of the frequency range assigned to one of the transmission towers on the northern edge of his territory. A scanning protocol he ran monthly to identify any out-of-band interference or unauthorized transmissions encroaching on licensed spectrum, and it presented as a clean, narrowband signal approximately 4 kHz wide, sitting in a portion of the spectrum that was designated for federal government use and was not. In this geographic area, actively assigned to any transmitting entity that Rowan could identify from the allocation database he maintained, and the signal was not the random frequency drift of an equipment malfunction or the broadband noise of a failing component, but a precise, stable, deliberate transmission. A signal that had been put there by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had aimed it carefully. He logged the frequency and time and returned to the office to run it against the federal allocation database and the regional interference registry. And neither returned a match, and he filed an inquiry with the FCC Interference Resolution Desk and returned to the site 2 weeks later to take a second measurement and confirm the signal was still present. And it was at precisely the same frequency, the same bandwidth, the same signal strength, completely stable. And he brought a portable direction-finding receiver this time and attempted to establish a bearing on the signal's source. And the bearing pointed northeast, into a section of the mountain range that contained no roads, no registered transmission infrastructure, no aviation navigation equipment, no authorized transmitter of any kind, according to every database he could access. He drove as far toward the bearing as the roads allowed, then continued on foot for approximately 40 minutes up the mountainside. Following the bearing on the portable receiver as the signal strength increased, and he found the source at the base of a granite outcropping at an elevation he estimated at 9,000 feet. A transmitter, fully operational, housed in a weatherproof equipment cabinet bolted to the rock face, drawing power from a solar array mounted on a south-facing ledge above it. The entire installation professional grade and clearly maintained. And when he examined the equipment cabinet's exterior, he found a data plate affixed to the front panel, the kind of metal plate used on all registered transmission equipment to identify the owner, the equipment type, the FCC license number, and the plate identified the transmitter's FCC license number. She photographed and ran against the FCC database when he returned to his vehicle. And the license number returned a valid active license, properly registered, fees current, maintenance records filed, with a listed licensee and an address in a city in the Midwest. And the license category was standard commercial microwave point-to-point, kind of license used for private data backhaul links between two specific fixed locations. And the license showed the transmitter's registered coordinates, which matched the location he was standing in, and the corresponding receiver coordinates, which were listed as a location in the mountain range, approximately 12 miles to the west. He drove to the receiver coordinates and found a second installation, identical configuration, professionally mounted. Same licensee data plate, and he stood between the two installations for a long time, understanding that someone had. With full regulatory compliance and entirely legal FCC licensing, constructed a private high-bandwidth microwave data link between two remote mountain locations with no publicly identified purpose. In a region with no commercial infrastructure or known private development, maintained in clean working order, licensed and fee current, and conducting what his instrumentation told him was an active and high-volume data transmission in both directions. And he submitted a full interference investigation report to his company and to the FCC. And the FCC's response, which arrived 6 weeks later, confirmed the license was valid and the installation was legally compliant and that no further regulatory action was indicated. And the response contained no information about what data was being transmitted through 12 miles of mountain air between two unmanned installations on a mountainside where no roads went. And Rowan has driven the boundary of his territory on the northern edge every month since without stopping at either installation, because the signal is still there, clean and stable and precise, and the license is still current. And whatever it is transmitting has been transmitting it, without interruption and without explanation for the 3 years since he found it. Lena Stroud was 41 years old and worked as a municipal archivist for a county historical records office in the upper Midwest. A position she had held for 14 years, in which she understood with the particular precision of someone whose professional life was built around the principle that every document had a provenance, an origin, a chain of custody, a verifiable history of who created it and when and why and how it arrived in the collection, that a document without a provenance was not simply incomplete but was, in the specific and important sense of archival science, suspect, because the value of a historical record was inseparable from the reliability of its chain of custody. And a document that could not be traced to a source was a document whose authenticity could not be established and whose authority could not be trusted. The collection she managed contained approximately 400,000 items spanning 160 years of county history, deeds, ordinances, vital records, correspondence, photographs, maps, meeting minutes, all cataloged, all provenance documented, all physically housed in the climate-controlled stacks that occupied the building's lower floors. And she knew the collection with the intimate and specific knowledge of someone who had spent 14 years handling its contents. And when a box appeared in the restricted stacks that she had not processed, and that bore no intake documentation, no accession number, no provenance record of any kind, she treated it with the precise professional response that such a discovery warranted. Not alarm, but methodical investigation. Because boxes without provenance appeared occasionally, donated materials delivered after hours, mislabeled transfers from other collections, and the investigation almost always produced a mundane explanation. The box contained photographs, approximately 300 photographic prints, black and white, the image quality and paper stock consistent with mid-20th century production, all depicting the county in recognizable locations: Main Street, the courthouse square, the river district, the old fairgrounds, and the photographs were not in themselves unusual, except that they were not in the collection's catalog and bore no identifying marks. No photographer's stamps.
Oh.
no dates written in the margin in the way that donated photographs typically arrived. She examined them systematically, beginning with the street scenes that would be most easily dated by the vehicles and storefronts in the backgrounds. And she established a probable date range of the late 1940s to mid-1950s. And then she found approximately 2/3 of the way through the box a photograph that stopped her. It showed the reading room of the county records office, this building. The same configuration of tables and shelving she worked in every day, and the photograph depicted a woman seated at the center reading table with her back to the camera, working at a document. And the woman's posture and the set of her shoulders and the specific way she held a document with both hands flat on the table were to Lena, who had sat at that table every working day for 14 years. Unmistakable in the way that your own posture in a photograph is unmistakable even when your face is not visible. And the clothing was not hers. The dress was period appropriate for the estimated date of the photograph, but the posture and the physical particularity of the person in the chair were hers in a way she could not dismiss and could not explain. And she turned to the next photograph, and it was the same room from a different angle. And the woman at the table was turning slightly toward the camera, not fully facing it, the profile just visible. And Lena looked at the profile for a long time and set the photograph face down on the table and did not pick it up again for 3 days. When she returned to the box, she worked through the remaining photographs systematically as she had been trained to do, and she found 4 more images of the reading room, each from a slightly different angle, and in each one the woman at the table was oriented differently, as though the photographer had been moving around the room documenting the space, and the woman was simply present in each frame, working apparently unaware of being photographed. And in the last of the 4, the woman was facing the camera directly with her eyes down, toward the document in front of her and her face fully visible, and it was her face. Not a resemblance, not a coincidence of bone structure, but her face on a woman in a mid-century dress in a photograph taken in this room approximately 70 years before. Lena Stroud was born. She documented all of this in a professional intake report that described the photograph's provenance status, physical condition, and estimated date range. And she described the content of the reading room photographs factually and without characterization. And she secured the box in the restricted catalog pending further provenance investigation. And she has been investigating the provenance for 2 years and has not found the origin of the box. And she comes to work every morning and sits at the center reading table and puts her hands flat on the document in front of her and works. And she does not look at the corner of the room where the first photograph's camera angle would have been positioned, because she has decided that whatever was in that corner with a camera 70 years ago had a reason for being there that she is not yet equipped to understand. Understanding it, she suspects, requires a kind of patience that is different from the patience of an archivist, which is already considerable, but is perhaps the patience of a person who has learned that some records document not what has happened, but what is still, in some fundamental way, happening. Irene Voss was 33 years old and had been working as an overnight security guard for 3 years, the last 14 months at a cold storage facility on the industrial edge of a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, a large commercial refrigeration complex servicing regional food distribution. 3 interconnected warehouse structures maintained at varying temperatures and staffed during business hours by a logistics team she interacted with at shift. Handover, but rarely otherwise, and the overnight shift was 8 hours of systematic circuit walking, camera monitoring, incident logging, and the specific and sustainable solitude that Irene had come to value precisely because it asked nothing of her except attention, which she was good at giving, and she had in 14 months settled into the facility with the ease of someone for whom overnight industrial spaces held no ambient dread, who was comfortable with the hum of refrigeration equipment and the particular quality of sound that large cold buildings made in the early hours, the settling and the ambient mechanical rhythm that became, after a few months, indistinguishable from silence. The logbook in the security booth was a physical document, a bound composition notebook of the kind used in the facility's security operations since before digital logging was adopted, maintained in parallel with the electronic system because the facility manager was a person who trusted redundancy, and entries were made by each guard at the start and end of shift, and at each completed circuit the standard notations of time, location, and status. Circuit 1 complete 11:14 p.m. All clear. The rhythmic and repetitive grammar of a record whose value was in its consistency. And Irene had been making these entries for 14 months in the same handwriting, the same format, the same notations, building a continuous record in the notebook alongside the electronic log. She was 40 minutes into her shift on a Wednesday in November. Having completed her first circuit and returned to the booth to make the entry, when she opened the logbook to the current page and found that the next entry in sequence, the entry she had been about to write, was already there, in handwriting that was hers and was not hers. The letter formations close enough to her own to suggest intention, but not so close as to be indistinguishable. A careful and deliberate approximation of her handwriting that read, Circuit 1, complete 11:14 p.m., all clear, which was the exact notation she made every night at this point in her shift, and which was accurate as the time displayed on the booth's clock. And she stood at the booth counter and looked at the entry for long enough that the clock advanced to 11:15 before she did anything else. She photographed the entry with her phone and logged a note in the electronic system. Anomalous logbook entry discovered. Photograph attached, and completed her shift without finding any other discrepancies. And the morning review by the facility manager and the security company's supervisor produced no explanation. The booth was the only keycard accessible area in the facility. The booth camera showed no one entering the booth between Irene's entry at shift start and her return. From the first circuit and the handwriting analysis, the security company commissioned and formally described the entry as a close but not identical approximation of Irene's own writing, consistent with an attempt at imitation rather than with Irene's own hand, which Irene found precise as a description and entirely insufficient as an explanation. The second anomalous entry appeared 11 days later, a circuit notation, correct time, correct location notation, written in the same approximating hand. Already present in the logbook when she arrived to make it, and the third appeared 6 days after that. And by the eighth occurrence, which came 3 months after the first, Irene had established that the entries always appeared in the logbook while she was on circuit, never before her shift, never visible when she began the shift. It's always present when she returned to the booth after completing a circuit, meaning that whatever was writing in the logbook was doing so in the 8 to 12 minutes she was away from the booth on each circuit. Using a key card, the access log never recorded, the space the camera never showed being entered, in a handwriting that was a careful study of hers, logging the correct time and the correct location, and always, without exception, the notation all clear, which is the notation Irene used when a circuit was clean, when nothing was wrong. When the facility was as it should be, And it was only in her 9th month of monitoring this pattern that she arrived at the question she should perhaps have asked at the beginning, and had been, for reasons she only partially understood, avoiding whatever was completing her logbook entries was telling her consistently, accurately, across 8 months of entries in a handwriting built from studying hers, that the facility was clear. That all was well, that there was nothing on her circuit that she needed to be concerned about. And the question was whether this was a reassurance or a warning, and whether the all clear that appeared in the logbook before she returned from each circuit was the record of a space that had been checked and found empty, or the record of a space that had been checked and found to contain something that someone or something was deliberately not logging. 10 stories, 10 professionals. 10 people who were trained their entire careers to be right about the things that mattered most in the rooms and the systems and the buildings they worked inside, and who found in the middle of ordinary work on an ordinary day that something had been operating inside those same rooms, those same systems, those same buildings, with equal precision and considerably more patience. A forensic accountant whose dead employees were doing the best work of their careers. A hospice chaplain receiving names before the names arrived. A dental hygienist, and a cavity that appeared in 31 consecutive patients in the same exact location. A building inspector whose stamp appeared on buildings the city had no record of building. A crisis counselor who received a warning that could not have been sent. An accountant whose ledger showed 19 months of payments she had never received. A nurse who saw something at the foot of a bed that she has never written in a chart. An RF engineer standing between 2 transmitters on a mountain no road reaches. An archivist who found her own face in a photograph taken 70 years before she was born. A security guard whose logbook is filled in before she returns from her rounds. These are not explanations. These are the records. The thing that connects all 10 of them is not the unexplained event. It is what each of these people did the morning after. They went back to work, because the work still needed doing, and they brought with them something that had not been there the morning before, which is the precise and irreversible knowledge that the world they move through every day has more inside it than the version they were trained to see. That knowledge does not make the work easier, but it makes the attention sharper. And in every one of these 10 cases, sharper attention is what saved something. A life, a record, a moment, a person waiting to be found. From True Terror Files Official, take care of yourselves tonight. And whatever you are doing tomorrow morning, whatever building you walk into, whatever file you open, whatever circuit you make, look a little closer than you did today.